All right, guys. Good to see everybody tonight. You know, one of the benefits of teaching and preaching through books of the Bible is that you can't skip anything. One of the things that happens when you preach through and teach through books of the Bible is that you can't skip anything. And so our text tonight, you can go ahead and turn to it, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, deals with some grown-up stuff. And so we have been dealing with that kind of thing the last few weeks. We're in that section in 1 Corinthians. And so we're going to deal with some of those things, talk about marriage, talk about the relationship, the physical relationship in marriage. We're going to talk a little bit about divorce. Paul hits all of these topics really in chapter 7. So let me remind you of what's going on. We're in a section in 1 Corinthians where Paul is really starting to point out specific sins within the church. He spent a lot of the first 2 or 3 chapters talking about the main issue at this church, and that is division. That's the big thing that really prompts him to write this book, where people are saying, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Jesus, that sort of thing. When you get to 1 Corinthians 6, he starts to, well, really 5, actually. When you get to 1 Corinthians 5, he deals with a relationship in the church where a man was having a relationship with his stepmother, so he's got to deal with that. In chapter 6, he deals with the fact that they are suing one another. They're going to the secular courts to deal with some of these things rather than dealing with them within the church. He's talked about and told them about their immorality, specifically their sexual immorality. And so he has just talked about the negative things that they're doing as far as, he says, don't you know that when you're with a prostitute, you're one flesh with that prostitute? And the reason he talks about that is because of the folks in Corinth, they've been saved out of a pagan background. And that was one of the ways pagans worshiped. And so the sanctification process is often very slow. And so they still had some sin in their life. They had some things they needed to take care of. What he's about to do in chapter 7, because he has just talked about sexuality and things in a very negative way at the end of 6, because he's had to deal with it, he's then going to talk about it in a positive way in the first part of chapter 7. And so some of the stuff is familiar with you're probably familiar with some of it maybe, unless you haven't come across 1 Corinthians in a while, you haven't thought about it. Let me read a few verses. I'll read the first 5, and then we'll deal with them. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1. He says, now concerning the matters about which you wrote, and then he quotes from them, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. But then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So he begins to address an issue within this congregation. And there is some discussion back and forth about what's actually going on in verse 1. And without going into all the details, I think what's happening in verse 1 is what he's already been doing some in chapter 6, where he quotes something back to them, something that they had said, and then he sets them straight on it. And so I think that's what he's doing here. So if you go back to verse 1, he says, now concerning the matters about which you wrote, and then here's the quote. Here's what they say. It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. What appears to have happened is some of the folks in the church had decided, for holiness reasons, for whatever it was, that even within marriage, there should be abstinence. That's pretty much what seemed to be happening here. And Paul's going to address that and say, no, that's a really bad idea. Don't do that. In fact, he's going to talk about later in the verses that he does wish, if people could, that they would be like him. And that is the fact that he is not married. We don't know. There's some conjecture whether or not maybe Paul was a widower. There's some verses that kind of hint maybe some of the verbiage that he uses, but we know that when he was saved, when he goes on his missionary journeys, that he's not married. He's single, and he's actually going to talk about the fact that in other places and later here that as a single person, he can serve the Lord fully. There's no one else that he's got to keep up with. So he's going to say, I wish you all could be like me. That would be great. And then, that way you could just take care of yourself and then devote all your time to the Lord. But for those that are married, what they're doing here is they're harming their marriage by bringing in something that God never intended for marriage. Because he's going to tell them towards the end of this paragraph, you can agree to stop for a while by mutual agreement and set that aside, but then come back together. So they have taken things that God never intended and have basically added to it, is what's going on. So verse 2, he says, but because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. You and I know, just the whole world, when we fell into sin in this area big time. And one of the gifts, there's a lot of gifts, a lot of things that marriage is a blessing for, and ultimately we know it's a picture of Christ in the church. We know that, it's for procreation and all of those things. But the physical relationship within marriage is a blessing from God as well. And so this is what he's trying to get them to understand. They're harming their marriages or harming their relationship by coming to this, we shouldn't do this at all. And so he's trying to get them to understand, and here's why. Verse 3, the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. So he lays that out there. And then he says why. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. This is what people forget. This is one of the problems often when you have unfaithfulness in marriage, when you have things like this, when you see people have affairs. Let me find the verse. It's interesting what he has just said in chapter 6. Oh, where is it? I didn't write it down. Here it is. Verse 19 of chapter 6. He says, or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? And then he says, you are not your own, for you were bought with a price, so glorify God in your body. We belong to God. Our bodies belong to God ultimately. Then if you're married, your spouse has that authority over your body, and you have your authority over your spouses. So when someone has an affair, when someone is involved in sexual immorality within marriage, not only have they sinned against God, not only have they violated that perfect picture of Christ in the church, they've also violated that relationship that they have with their spouse. And so ultimately, within marriage, you are not in charge of your body. You don't have that authority. Your spouse does, and it goes both ways. If more people would understand that when you get married, you become one flesh. You are one institution. It's not just two people who live together and sign a piece of paper. You've probably seen marriages like this where it's, people date and they get along and things are great, and then they get married and they still end up kind of living two separate lives. And you almost never see them together, and there's that. To me, that's really sad. And a lot of times those marriages don't last, at least the ones I'm familiar with. But if you're married, there is a spiritual thing going on there. That's why divorce is so painful, because you're one flesh. And when divorce takes place, or when a spouse dies, there's a painfulness there because of that separation, because you were one. and that one has been torn. I mean, there's actual, there's pain, there's sadness, there's all of those things. So we belong to one another. So he says in verse 5, do not deprive one another, except perhaps. So now he's going to address really where they've gone too far in verse 1. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time. So almost like a fasting situation. So that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Lack of self-control, we kind of talked about that last week in a lot of areas. Here specifically within the context of sex, self-control, just like I said last week, just walk into Walgreens and go down the magazine aisle and, just the images that are there, or, things are just so available now with the internet and all the things. I mean, we're constantly bombarded. Our poor, so you see so many things that our kids are having to deal with now, this constant drive to sexualize things that there's no reason to do that. That's the world we're in right now. So there's this constant temptation. There's this constant idea of it. And one of the blessings God has given us for that, to deal with that, is marriage. So they've messed up. In verse 1, they said, no, if we're going to be spiritual, we're not going to do that at all. And he says down here in verse 5, well, if you're going to do that, what you really need to do is just do it for a while, for a specific reason, for prayer, that sort of thing, and then come back together. So he lays it out there for husbands and wives. Our bodies are not ours. If you're a husband, your body belongs to your wife. If you're a wife, your body belongs to your husband. That's mutual. Right? One doesn't have more power over one than the other, so we are one flesh, and we're told that this is something God has given us. You see why I went through this on a Wednesday night and can you imagine me preaching this on Sunday morning? Wouldn't that be fun? Yeah. I'd have to have Joe on and say, look, you need to do something with kids, on this deal. So that's one of the reasons we're doing it now. So that's the first 5 verses. He just very much, lays it out there pretty clearly. Well, he's going to deal with some other stuff. He says, verse 6, now as a concession, not a command, I say this. I wish that all were as myself am, that reads funny, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. Paul was single, he wasn't married. And probably the most famous Christian who, like pastor, writer, theologian, who stayed single his whole life, at least in the last part of the 20th century, was a fellow named John Stott. Y'all probably aren't familiar with Stott. That's my mother's maiden name, so I don't know if we're kin to one another going back, hundreds of years. But anyway, Stott was he was English, and he pastored, I can't remember the name of the church in the London area. But anyway, he wrote all kinds of commentaries and traveled the world and spoke at conferences and did all this stuff. And he attributed that to the fact that God never, how did he put it? There were a couple of times he said where he almost got married, like he was dating somebody and they would get pretty close, and then it just wouldn't work out. And eventually later in life, he realized that his singleness was a blessing because he would not have had the ministry that he had otherwise, because he didn't need to be at home with his wife, and if they'd had children, taking care of them. And so his calling was to remain single. And he did. And I've got books all in my office by that guy. And he went all over the world and did some great stuff. And then he went to be with the Lord, I don't know, in the last 10 years or so. And I've known other people who have they've stayed single all of their life, and they've served the Lord and loved the Lord. That is the exception. That's a unique thing, that the Bible doesn't actually list by name a gift of singleness. It's not any of the lists of spiritual gifts. But Paul kind of implies it here anyway. When he talks about, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. He seems to at least be attributing some sense of this is something God has allowed in his life so that he can serve. And he wishes everybody could be like him. He seems to be very happy like that. But now he's going to talk to married folks. And he's going to deal with some of the things that married folks have to deal with. Verse 8, to the unmarried and to the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. So that's good. If you can stay single, be single. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Now, I got to tell you a funny story about that. When I heard this story when I was in seminary. Apparently this happened at the seminary years ago. It was really interesting. In seminary, in Mid-America, this was before everything was online. So if you were a student there, you were pretty much on campus. And it was always funny. If a single girl showed up and was a student, the single guys, I mean, it was just like, whew, you know, I mean, they were, and if people started dating, we knew they were getting married within like 2 months. I mean, it was just happening. So the story was that at something at Mid-America, maybe it was a classroom or something, some fella stood up, kind of a country preacher kind of guy, and he was single, and he stood up and he quoted this verse, and he said, you know, the Bible says it is better to marry than to burn with passion. And he goes, brothers, I am burning. And so everybody was real, like, you know, don't look at one another. This is not, you know, he was trying to bare his soul, but it was like, oh my goodness, what is he saying? You know, it's just, I can see it happening. But that's what Paul says. He talks about the fact that if you don't have this gift of singleness, if God hasn't granted you this, that this is part of your calling, you need to get married, because we all deal with these things. Verse 10, to the married, I give this charge. So he's talking to people first who aren't married. He says, stay single if you can. If you can't, okay. But now he's got to talk about some specifics. To the married, I give this charge. Not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. Divorce and remarriage is an interesting thing to talk about within the context of the Bible. I think there are two very clear ways that are two very, very clear allowances for biblical divorce. Here, he's going to talk about in a minute, abandonment by an unbeliever. We'll probably get to those verses here in a few minutes. The other one Jesus talks about in the Gospels, and that is adultery. I think those are very, very clear. I'll tell you what I wrestle with, and I go back and forth on this because, you know, the Bible never addresses abuse within marriage. It doesn't say a word about it. So I spent a lot of time thinking about this, and here's where I have fallen, I think. I don't have chapter and verse, so this, I could be wrong, right? This is kind of how I think about it, and I'm still, as Jed Clampett would say, I'm still studying on it. Adultery is a sin against that one flesh relationship. And I think as far as applying other areas and looking at other things that the Bible doesn't address, I lean towards that abuse, physical and mental, is also against that one flesh relationship. I think. That's kind of, so if I had somebody come to me tomorrow and they said, preacher, my husband or wife, because that happens too, is physically abusive or mentally abusive, and there's no way to reconcile, and we're going to get a divorce, I think I'd probably, biblically, I think they're probably in an okay area. I would most likely do a remarriage if they found somebody else down the road. But the Bible doesn't address that issue. And when the Bible doesn't address issues, we have to take the principles in Scripture and say, is there some kind of application here? Is there something that's parallel in this? And like I said, this is an area that I'm still going back and forth on it. That's just me thinking about those things now. But the two specific things where the Bible does say is if a believer abandons you, we'll get to those verses, and the other one is adultery. Paul's not concerned about that right now in this part of the paragraph. He doesn't address the adultery issue. We don't know why he doesn't, but you know, he was writing to a specific group of people for a specific reason. He's not trying to write a whole theology of divorce and remarriage, so he doesn't mention that in the Gospels. What he says is the principle is that if you're both saved, divorce should be off the table. That's what he's saying here in verse 10. To the married, and he's talking specifically to married believers here, I give this charge, not I but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. So if your marriage is having problems, the answer for a Christian couple, divorce shouldn't even come into the conversation. It should be, what do we need to do to straighten this out? What do we need to do to strengthen our relationship? And let me tell you this, and this is for everybody watching too. Do not wait to come to me or another pastor until you're ready to sign the document, because that's typically what happens. By the time somebody comes to me or to Brother Bill or Joe Don or Adam or anybody else, the relationship has gotten so bad and everything has gotten so toxic and they've been going back and forth for so long, you can't help people straighten something out in a week that's been bad for 10 years. You can't do it. You know, this is the people stopping off and saying, hey, we're on the way to sign the divorce papers. We're supposed to be there at 2. It's 1:30. Can you fix this? It's not happening. Now, that's only a slight exaggeration. I had this experience where it was just a few days out, right? It's too late. If you need to talk to somebody, if you need to talk to a marriage counselor, you need to get some help. As soon as you know you need some help, get the help. Otherwise, you're going to wait too long and do it. I had a couple come into my office one time, not here, in another place, and I didn't know them. They were believers, and they went to another church on another part of town, and I think they were embarrassed maybe to talk to their pastor, and they had a friend in the church I was at, and he said, would you talk to him? And when they came in and sat in my office, both of them, when they talked, the only word out of either one of their mouths were the word I. And both of them were so self-centered. Both of them, the marriage had gotten so bad that it was almost beyond hope. And this had been going on for years. I mean, and I pointed that out to them. I said, y'all realize neither one of you have said we in all of this. I mean, you're extremely self-centered in all these things. And I don't think that marriage lasted. I mean, I came to it so late in the process, and they probably didn't like some of the stuff I said to them. I never saw them again. But I just tried to point out reality to them in a nice way. But don't wait. Do not wait. If you're having issues, get help. If you don't want to talk to me, I can point you in the right direction, but you do not wait on this, because if you wait too long, often things can't be resolved. So he says to believers there, shouldn't get divorced. Verse 12, to the rest. So these are people who are, he's going to point out in a minute, the believers who are married to unbelievers. We've all known these couples too. To the rest I say, I, not the Lord, because Jesus didn't address this, so Paul, with the authority of an apostle, is going to do that, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. Because apparently some of the things that were happening in the Corinthian church, and this was really an issue in a lot of churches in this first century, was people would get saved, their spouse wouldn't get saved, and then they would think, well, do I need to leave them and find a Christian to marry? And so that's what he's addressing here. He's like, no. You need to stay. Stay where you are when you came to the Lord. If you were married, stay married, even if that person is lost. Verse 13, if any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. So he's saying, if the unbelieving spouse is willing to stay in the marriage, stay married. Verse 14. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. Now, what Paul isn't saying here, Paul is not saying that these people are saved because one person in the family is a believer. He's talking about the influence of Christianity within that family. Peter talks about this in 1 Peter 3, where he says, "Likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives when they see your respectful and pure conduct." So what Paul is saying with this idea of the husband and the kids is that these marriages, even though one of them is lost, these are real marriages. These are legitimate marriages, and that person's Christian influence needs to be within that family. So stay with that person. However, that person may make some decisions. Verse 15. "But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so." So they initiate, they decide they're leaving. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. So I always interpreted that as you're free to remarry, obviously within the Lord only. God has called you to peace. "For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband," which is what I just read in 1 Peter, "or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife?" So don't try to get out of the marriage. If you get saved and they don't, you don't know. It might take years. It might be, you may pray for that person and they may see you get up and go to church every Sunday for 50 years and finally come to faith in Jesus. You just don't know. And you model Christ within the marriage, whether your husband, whether your wife, whatever it is. So Paul here is really addressing some stuff. And here's the sentence I wrote, and then I'll talk about it a little bit for the point of the paragraph. And I wrote, "It's God, not the world, who sets the standard for marriage and singleness." Because what we see here is so contrary to what we see out there. In the world, you can get divorced for whatever reason, right? I know years ago you had to prove certain things but now we have no-fault divorce. Used to be you had to prove adultery. You had to do all kinds of things to actually go through a divorce. If you go back and read history and other things like that, you see some of that, like in political leaders and stuff, like they've got to figure out how to set things up so people get caught so they actually can get a divorce and that sort of deal. We don't have that anymore. Now you just go in and do the thing and sign the papers, and I think it's like a 30-day waiting period. I don't know. I don't even know if they still put that in the paper. I know really nosy people used to read that part in the newspaper all the time. "Did you hear so-and-so? They're getting a divorce." Well, why are you reading that section? You just need to stop, I've known people like that. But so there's no fault divorce. And if you're just not happy, if you've fallen out of love or whatever, well, love is a lot of things. It's a choice you make. Yes, it's an emotion. Yes, it's a feeling. Yes, all those things are true. But it's a choice you make. You have signed on the dotted line that you're going to love this person. And that's not something to take lightly. And yet the world does. Very much. Just whatever. They're divorced and they just move on. The other thing is this idea within marriage of, I don't belong to me. My wife has the authority. And I have the authority over her. As Americans, we don't really like that. I'm in charge of me. And we forget sometimes that marriage is mutual in all ways. And it's every marriage that I've seen break up, and I've seen some stuff happen in my years in ministry, it almost always boils down to selfishness. That's almost always the root cause. It boils down to a person thinking that their idea about something is more important than the actual relationship, and the marriage will blow up. And it'll manifest in a lot of different ways, whether it's in affairs, whether it's in have neglected their family because of job and the idea of success or whatever it might be. And that idea of, back to Ephesians, I haven't mentioned it, but in Ephesians 5, wives, be submissive to your husbands and all of that. That is true. Obviously, that's the picture of marriage. But there's a mutual understanding in that we're to love one another and respect one another. We're both created in the image of God, and we are one flesh. And this is not a throwaway thing. This is an actual theological relationship. It's a picture of Christ in the church. In God's eyes, when you get married, you are no longer two people. You're one unit. You're one thing. You are one flesh. The world doesn't like that idea. The world wants freedom. You probably read about things, without getting graphic about it, I saw there was a police force here in Tennessee that fired a bunch of police officers because a bunch of them, 4 or 5 of them, were up to stuff together. And the one that prompted the whole thing was a female police officer who was in an open marriage. That flies completely in the face of what Paul's just said here. But that's what that's the kind of thing the world pushes. And so it's God, it's not the world, because the world standards change. Like I said, 100 years ago, you had to prove things to get a divorce. You don't have to do that anymore. I do know at one time, even in the last 10 years or so, there was a certain marriage certificate in Arkansas that you could get that was not a no-fault marriage certificate. You had to, and I knew a pastor who would only do marriages if they got that license. And so if they were going to get divorced, they had to prove adultery or whatever. I mean, it was still around, just on the other side of the river. I don't know of any other states that do it. I'm not familiar with Tennessee having one. But the world standards for marriage, for the physical relationship within marriage, the world standards for divorce, they're all completely contrary to the Word of God. And it's one of those things that makes us stand out. Because if you stick with a marriage that's having trouble and you make some sacrifices and you put that other person first, you show the world, I'm serious about this. This matters. Rather than, I'm out of here. I'm going to just go find the next person. And then the next person. And you've probably all known people who have been married, 5, 6 times. It happens. I've got them in my family. It's just, we all do. And it's sad. It is absolutely sad. Because here's what I've noticed. This is an uplifting night, isn't it? Yeah. Here's what I've noticed as a pastor. I've been in the room a lot when the machines have been turned off. And the kids can't always make it. And sometimes church members can't always be there. Do you know who's always in the room? It's the spouse. That's how important this relationship is. It's one that till death do us part is a real thing. And that's the picture. That's what it's supposed to be. And if we don't take that seriously, then we're disobeying God. We're dishonoring the picture of Christ in the church. Christ would never divorce his church. He would never cheat on his church. He would never do any of that because he is perfect and we are his bride. And so Paul's trying to get these pagans to grow in their faith enough to get all that stuff right. And you and I have the opportunity to do that, whether we're married, whether we're single, whether we're widower, whatever it is. We know how to honor God in that, specifically in this area. And it's not according to the world standards. So, well, there you go. There's chapter 7, 1 through 16. We're not done with this stuff. He's going to talk some more about it. It'll be a whole lot more fun when we get to food sacrificed to idols. Don't worry. Yeah, that'll be a blast. But anyway, and then we get to the Lord's Supper and people are dying, because they're taking the Lord's Supper in the wrong way. But so for those of you who are watching, thank you all for being here. We're going to log off and go over our prayer sheet. If you have any questions, send me an email to John, John, at mycbcc.org, and hopefully I can answer any questions that you might have. But we're going to log off now, so we appreciate it.